shocking that there be this kind of pushback in order to not allow those creeping ambitions to develop. Very much a case of what happened with Georgia. Second point embedded in what Matt said that I want to come back to as well, what is Article 5 and how strongly do we feel about it? After Russia invaded Georgia, several allies commented to me at NATO that, well, it's a good thing we didn't invite Georgia to join NATO, because then we would have made Article 5 meaningless because we obviously wouldn't have gone to defend them. And that was a shocking statement to me, because the point is, if it's a solemn commitment. If you make an Article 5 commitment, you're going to defend someone, you have to do it. It's not an option when it arises. And I made the very impolite point, since it was a German among those who said it, that I'm certainly glad the United States didn't feel that way about Germany during the Cold War, because that was the whole point. You had a divided country that we were willing to defend. Now, to your question about some positives. One of the things in the debate here in Sweden is, well, what about NATO membership? Should we consider or should we not consider? And, the first thing you need to know is that no one in the U.S. cares. It's up to Sweden if it wants to join NATO or not. If you do, great. We love Sweden. You got great, relative to some other allies, great military capabilities. Come on along. But if you don't, but you're still willing to contribute in Afghanistan and other peacekeeping operations, crisis management, that's great too. We'll live with whatever. What you don't have by being a member of NATO is decision making. NATO's going to make decisions about what to do no matter what, and you either are part of that process or you're not. So you're not as long as you're not a member. Now that's a choice for Sweden to make, and there's a whole domestic culture here going back to the Napoleonic Wars. So Sweden's going to make its own choices. The one thing I would say that's constructive, I hope, is that if the United States is looking at what's going to keep it interested, why would the United States work with Sweden and Baltic states and Finland and others on Nordic-Baltic security issues? What the U.S. is going to be looking for is certainty. So if we commit to something, will other partners there be able to commit to? For example, if you do Nordic participation in air policing all over the region, over the Baltic states, but all over the region, if something happens, will Sweden take part in responding to that or not? Because if the answer is no, then we don't want Sweden in. But if the answer is yes, then that's a great contribution. So a suggestion that I would have is for Sweden to think in terms of, if you are interested in the security of the Nordic-Baltic region, and if you are coming to realizations that you can't provide for Swedish security alone, such as these bomber flights toward Sweden 2 weeks or whenever that was, a few weeks ago, point out, then you do want to be part of a larger framework of cooperation. And even if it's a Nordic-Baltic framework of cooperation, as long as there's a certainty of Swedish participation in that, you can probably attract the U.S. into that. The U.S. has always viewed this this air policing as, we'll go so far, but we don't want to commit to this for the long term. We're not sure about Russia's degree of threat, how much it costs us to do this. But I think you could attract the U.S. into that if there were certainty that it were a regional response that included everybody.
Yes, but why would the U.S. agree to such a thing? Because that would be like almost NATO, but not NATO.
Well, because we're committed in NATO to the concept of security for the Baltic states. We're also committed on an interim basis to the air policing missions. And one of the reasons we hesitate to make a permanent commitment to the air policing missions is we're afraid it's only going to end up being us in the end.
Okay. It seems to me that the nations around the Baltic Sea are we're very close friends, but we have different strategic interests, and we can't seem to get our act together for historical reasons and so on. And you had some ideas on how to cooperate, and that would be the one. Your suggestion now was a way to cooperate outside NATO for Sweden and Finland. But any other suggestions how to solve the problem? There's a puzzle here. Matt?
How to correlate You mean how to correlate the divergent strategic visions of each of the Nordic Baltic states?
Yeah, we are friends, we have a common interest
Yeah.
here, but we have different viewpoints. But
Yeah.
so, is there a way to solve the problem?
That's a deep philosophical question. The only way to solve it is to do it and have concrete projects. So from my parochial perspective of where I often sit and on top of the beautiful Toompea Hill in Tallinn, I mean, one great area is cybersecurity. And something in which Estonia truly is an international leader, and one in which Latvia is also developing a strong capability, and one in which is another one of those areas in which the Baltic states can be and are net contributors to the alliance. But I think we need concrete projects, and you're asking for other concrete projects. I think energy security is not a NATO issue, but an EU issue that, is one in which the Baltic states working together under what Lithuanian ambassador showed, the Baltic Energy Market Integration Program, can help Europe if all these bits of infrastructure are built and then are integrated. The Baltic states will take a major step in helping the European Union achieve one of its biggest strategic goals. I mean, it's a dual goal, which is one, to create a unified energy market by the end of next year, which is not going to happen, but sometime soon. And then, by extension, completing a Europe whole and free and hopefully at peace. Because, as we said before, the Baltic states are now energy islands. They are not fully integrated into the economic space of the European Union because of energy. So that's a concrete step that everyone ought to agree on, and it requires collaboration and deep cooperation between the Baltic states and the Nordic states, particularly on electricity, the Estlink 1, Estlink 2, cables, also the one from Sweden to Lithuania, as well as the natural gas pipeline under the Baltic Sea that will connect Finland and Estonia.
Okay, and just moving on to you, Bruce, I would like to sharpen the question a little bit. I mean, we have had this partnership going on with Sweden and Finland with NATO for almost 20 years now. It's like being engaged but not married. So, isn't it? Why doesn't the U.S. just say, well, let's do it? Get married.
You mean why do we not advocate NATO membership?
Yes.
Well, I mean, if you're going to use that analogy, sometimes when you have that kind of relationship, you get the things you want without having to go the full marriage route. And
so what would we get then?
Well, I tell you, the entire time I was the attaché, never once was I in a senior level meeting where somebody asked me, or asked the Swedish counterparts that I was usually escorting to visit, says, are they going to put some defenses on Gotland? Or the only people that ever asked, are they going to join NATO, were people that had nothing else to ask or really didn't know what it was they were dealing with, because that was not an American agenda. What they were interested in the years that I was there, was what capability you're taking with to Afghanistan. What capability can you provide for Libya? What are you going to do about the Horn of Africa? They're very engaged in that sort of thing. One of the most significant things under my time here that Sweden did was our defense secretary came repeatedly and said, Europe needs to produce some helicopters and get them down to Afghanistan. And Sweden was one of the few that said, well, that's something we can do. And, oops, I guess my batteries are shot now too, but that's the kind of capability that we were interested in, is downrange capability. So we're talking about Baltic security now, not worldwide security, but there is a bit of an ante that Sweden has paid by participating with NATO elsewhere. Does that secure them in the event of a Baltic contingency? No. You heard Anders Fogh Rasmussen answer that question clearly, but there is still this notion that these guys are our friends and partners, and they've helped where we've needed help, and so there's a need from our perspective to honor that and says, yeah, we're part of this, and we're going to look hard at those sorts of questions. But those aren't questions for a military officer; those are questions for the politicians, and the diplomats. But well, I guess I'll end there.
Okay, thank you.
Unless there was a follow-up.
No. I'll think it's time for taking questions from the floor. Now, since we're running out of microphones here, so you have to do without them, which means that you have to stand up and speak.
I can change batteries well.
Yeah, all right. So, any questions?
Mats Johansson again. I'd like you all to comment on my previous question on sequestration and what it means in terms of cut-downs that affect, especially in the Nordic and Baltic countries. Does it matter to us if you spend $600 billion or $700 billion?
Let me take a crack at that. I think it does, but not for the obvious reasons. We can do fine with $50 billion less defense spending and do all sorts of things. But what it boils down to is what choices do we make to execute that cut? And right now, we're making choices about what to cut that I would argue are not aimed at orienting towards a strategy that is sustainable, that keeps us engaged. We're making choices about cutting engagements. And that, I think, is the problem. There's no ambition that's clear in the Pentagon as to what we want to be able to do today. Now, maybe with a new QDR is coming up. A new QDR is coming up. And that should probably result in some thinking about what our strategy is that we want to be able to do. We could certainly cut some big weapon systems. We could certainly go for cheaper variants of things. We are going to downsize the force a little bit, but we could do that with a forward deployed, expeditionary, crisis management, and Article 5 defense capability if those were the choices we're making. But right now, I think we are, making choices that emphasize how painful these cuts are to try to pretend that we're not going to have to live through them. And then we're also making choices that are as if they're going to go away a few years from now, so we're just weathering it by not cutting anything big. But I think strategically we could live with it.
Yep, I would, well, I think they're philosophical and concrete consequences. Philosophically, I think the notion that we have to cut back so much year after year after year is reinforcing this predisposition toward withdrawal that Kurt talked about before. Concretely, you see it in small areas, but that are still significant in terms of what you did for your career as a defense attaché, right? I mean, I see people in Tallinn or wherever I may be, or going back to Washington from our military, who are unable to attend seminars and participate in military-to-military programs because of the sequestration. If those programs are an important tool of diplomacy, and we're not doing them, that's bad. But the other point is the one you raised earlier, I think it was you, Kurt, about our participation in Steadfast Jazz. I mean, I think the Estonian contingent is going to be bigger than the American one. I mean, what signal is that sending about Article 5 and the U.S. commitment to Europe? That's quite problematic in a philosophical sense. And sensing we might be coming to an end, I just wanted to be unambiguous personally in how I strategically view Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Personally, I think would be a huge alteration of the strategic calculus that Russia must look at in the Gulf of Finland and throughout the Baltic, and I suppose Kurt probably feels the same way. But I agree that in Washington, people just really aren't focused on this, haven't absorbed what a dramatic and positive shift this would end up being. It would be, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, perhaps the most significant step taken, I think, to help paradoxically manage Russia in the long run as a country that could actually be a strategic partner rather than just rhetorically talking about that.
We'll take two questions from Charlie and then from Robert.
Thank you. I'd like to continue on that point. Say Finland and Sweden were to join NATO. The Baltic countries and Poland had some problems opening up NATO's planning. Do you think Finland and Sweden can get guarantees, especially from the US, that this will be done? I'm asking because I suspect these two countries' politicians must be able to say, look, I've seen the plans or something equivalent to that. Do you think we can get there?
Well, yeah, that's for you.
That's a hard question to follow, and I don't want to put anybody on the panel on the spot. Shouldn't we talk more about less about the defense cuts and the sequester, and more perhaps about the underlying problems, the structural fiscal problems, the political paralysis that is underlying this? That was the first prong. The second prong, Ambassador Volker said he had only read in books when isolationism was a political force. I'm old enough to remember the 70s, and we saw mutatis mutandis, something like that, following Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation, the collapse of Bretton Woods, Kissinger's Spenglerian sense of the world coming to an end. And in the end, that ended with Ronnie saying, "It's morning in America." What's likely to bring America back on the street again? Is it to be something positive, to regain self-confidence, or is it a challenge like the hostage crisis in Iran?
Okay, I'm going to see if I can do three things at once. So one of them, on Article 5 collective defense planning, the problem for the plans was never the US. It was Germany. And that has still been something of an issue as to defining what these exercises are and where they take place. And then after Germany, a few other countries that Germany, for reasons of appearing to be provocative, if you can get through that logic, and from some other allies, feeling that it's a distraction from their part of the alliance that they care about. I think that, at least from an American point of view, there wouldn't be any hesitation about saying, yeah, we'll develop defense plans. From the broader perspective of budgets in the US and dysfunctionality, first off, yes, dysfunctionality is a huge, huge problem. It's one of the things that has prevented better decision making on things like what to do with the defense budget or what are our priorities in the world. In terms of isolation, I would test a little bit, because even with everything that you accurately described about the 70s, we nonetheless had an engaged US military. We had an active effort at peace negotiations in the Middle East in the Carter administration, which resulted in the Camp David Accords. We were negotiating strategic arms limitation treaty at the time, which at that point mattered, so that we were looking at a way to reduce the threat from Russian strategic missiles. That's very different focus than what anyone talks about in nuclear negotiations today. So you're right. There was a clear period after Vietnam when we were in the doldrums, but there was still activism. And the final point, since I mentioned the one about certainty in response and air defense, I'm sure there must be some naval officers or former naval officers here, and you may know better than I do. But my thought is, in parallel to the air policing, something that might be somewhat attractive to the US Navy would be a comprehensive maritime picture of the entire Nordic-Baltic area, including the Arctic, but also including the Baltic, that others helped provide and helped to patrol, so that the US could find some benefit in this, which again would be a way of helping to attract the US in the area.
Maybe I'd just add a couple small points of humility about the United States to underscore, obviously, we're not the answer to every problem. We don't know the best way to do things on planning. I just remember what happened after August 2008 and how even in the Bush administration, which has been lambasted by the Obama administration for being anti-Russian, we could not get the planning through, right? The contingency planning for the Baltic states in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion of Georgia, and that was in the Bush administration. So we don't always have all the answers, but thank goodness the Obama administration did make that happen over time. And then finally, just very briefly on the compelling question about the United States and when's it going to break out of its funk? And yeah, I agree with you, Kurt. Throughout the 70s, the U.S. diplomacy was active, and my problem today is it seems like we don't really want to be active. We don't want to resolve problems in the world. We maybe want to manage them or just not even pay attention to them in many cases. But that is simply not sustainable. The United States still, with the rise of China, great, but it's still the world's largest economy. And even when China surpasses the U.S. in GDP, we're still going to be number 2. It's hard to say, but we're still going to be a really powerful country. we have enduring global interests, and many of those are economic. And so the economic recovery, we hope, is happening, right? We've got positive growth, 2.5%. Unemployment is decreasing. Structural reforms have taken place. And so it doesn't, the stock market is at record highs, but so are European stock markets. But the economy hopefully is coming out of the doldrums. And I just think that once we awaken from this crisis once and for all, we have to realize, whether it's in the form of the transatlantic trade agreement or whatever the heck we call it, or simply the force of global events for such a huge country, we're going to have to care about global engagement. And it may take a while for it to return to military engagement, military security engagement, just as it took us a while to get out of the funk of the 1970s, and finally we had Grenada and U.S. military was back. So probably there will need to be some crisis that really gets us active again in a military security sense. But I just think it's inevitable that as the economy strengthens and we again see how interdependent we are economically, we'll be back on the stage.
I'd like to take a quick crack at the planning question too. The ambassadors are going to look at planning different than a military officer will, because they're dealing with the political consequences of acknowledging that a plan is under development. That's a big deal. NATO membership for Sweden and Finland, from a military officer's perspective, is going to produce a much higher quality plan much quicker, because there's going to be integration of all the officers. They're going to be talking with one another right now. If you go to EUCOM and ask them, they won't answer because it'll be classified, but what are they thinking in terms of Swedish capabilities? Well, they're going to open up Wikipedia, and say, "What do you got?" And they're going to look at lengths of runways and stuff like that. And there's not going to be the type of engagement that they have with a NATO member country, where they immediately pick up the phone and says, "This is the guy that's the base commander for that base." He says, "What kind of fuel do you have? What kind of capacity do you have?" And so the ability to produce a real plan, like what they're talking about, as opposed to the kinds of things that military officers are thinking about, is going to be far greater, far quicker. And when they were talking about Baltic contingency plans, they're talking about the formal plan. But that kind of exchange happened between military officers, and I think that they could crap out a plan pretty quick once they're given the go-ahead to do it, because they talk to one another. And just take the difference between Finland and Sweden. Finland has F-18s. That's an American airplane, and so there are American people up there that cooperate with the development of their use of that F-18. And so there's insight into what's going on in Finland that doesn't exist in Sweden, or at least it didn't exist until we started with things like Loyal Arrow and other types of cooperation. So we're on that path. NATO membership would quickly accelerate that path. So.
Okay, thank you. May I have the microphone, please? And with that message, it's time for us to end this day. And before we do that, I would like Morten to come up here, please. As long as I have everyone's attention. Thank you, panelists. I think we can give them a hand, a round of applause. Thank you. And
Thank you.
Morten, could you please join me at the stage? Now, since this is the last session when we will end in just a few minutes, I would like to introduce the man behind the whole conference, planning almost everything. I would say everything.
Probably everything.
Yes. Together with me, I share office with you, you remember? We talk. We haven't prepared any presents for you, but I think an applaud will do, right? Probably. Yes. And thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have found all the our panels interesting, and the discussions too. And I think usually in conferences the most interesting discussions is going on at coffee breaks and lunches. So stay a while, and some of us will have dinner also. Thank you.